For many of us who grew up on the prairie, the idea of living in a small town has a sense of nostalgia and simplicity to it. For those of us who spent a good deal of time during their childhood in the backseat of the car, traveling across the vast expanses, the sight of a grain elevator on the horizon meant that a rest stop was a very definite possibility, and a soda could be bought at the town's cafe. Right now, Prairie Theatre Exchange is presenting a show that makes the proposition, if heaven is real, it is a small prairie town. And if you go there when you die, you become the truest version of yourself for eternity. And the stories and myths that you and your family have created will be remembered forever. Running from November 5th through to November 17th, PTE is presenting Ponderosa Pine. Written by Andraea Sartison, the play explores a family's history through the fictional prairie town of Valhalla, where the only thing breaking up the horizon is a large ponderosa pine that has sprouted from a tiny seed. The tree is a symbol of the community itself and the array of characters that live in the town. Ponderosa Pine is a one-woman show. The story is told through the eyes of the narrator. The narrator tells the myths and legends and spins the tales of the people in Valhalla. The narrator for PTE's presentation of Ponderosa Pine is played by actor Tracy Penner. Penner is a graduate of the University of Alberta. She has performed with such companies as Dry Cold Productions, Winnipeg Jewish Theatre, Shakespeare in the Ruins, and the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre. And joining me here in the Classic 107 studio to talk about PTE's production of Ponderosa Pine, I am joined by actor Tracy Penner and playwright Andraea Sartison. Hello to you both. So nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, Andraea, I want to start with you and the story of how you got the source material for the play. Can you talk about how that process came about? It was really your family that really helped create the characters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a time in my life where I had just had my first child, and at the same time my Mafa, which is the name for my maternal grandfather, was passing away. So I was really interested about the stories that we pass on. What is our legacy? What do we inherit? And what do we pass on, as I said? And so to sort of explore that, I started talking to a lot of my family members about like what were the stories that were really iconic for them in their lives. And I posed this question, like if heaven is a small prairie town and you're the truest version of yourself, like you said, how old are you and what are you doing? And so then their answers became the characters of the town, and those stories that they identified, they played out those stories in different ways, in ways that didn't happen in real life, but ways that I reimagined it for the story.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk about how you took these stories and spun them into the characters and created the characters in the town of Valhalla?
Yeah, it was a long process. I really started writing this about 6 years ago, and first I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and I wrote like 80 pages of memories, my memories and also my family's memories that I collected. And then in looking back at them, I was able to, working with my dramaturg, who's Thomas Morgan-Jones, I was able to pull out like what are these sort of strongest characters, the characters of my grandparents who are Ivan and Frida in the play, and sort of really special stories that kept appearing, and then shape all of the narrative around it so that it became, a play.
That sounds really fantastic. When I was researching and prepping for the interview, one of the things that I discovered about you is that this whole idea of oral tradition and passing on stories and folklore is something that you're incredibly interested in. You did a 2015 production called Mission Potluck, which is along similar lines. Why is this such a fascination for you?
I don't know. I think there's been, there's maybe an external call for everybody in the artistic and the theater community to like tell your own stories, to not try to adopt and adapt stories that don't belong to you. And so maybe it's part of that is to be like, well, who am I and what are my stories and are the stories that I hold of value? But I think also for me personally, like, I think anytime that I see something on stage that I can relate to, it's powerful. So I have to believe, too, that if I can give something honest and true from myself, that will be powerful to another person as well. So I think it's both of those things. It's like, yeah, telling the truth about who you are, and for all the right reasons. That's going to be interesting, and that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. From what I understand, the play starts out with Valhalla being burnt down. First of all, is that right? And if so, Tracy, can you talk about how you start the show? Does the play start right after the fire? And can you talk about the significance that the fire has in moving the story forward?
Yeah. So the play starts with a woman coming on stage to tell this story. There's a microphone, just like the one we have here, and she's there to tell this story as the narrator. What's beautiful about the story is not only is it about the small town, but it's also about the narrator's personal journey in becoming the narrator. So we do indeed start the play with a fire, which is the catalyst that starts this chain of events that take us through the play.
Fantastic. One of the things I'm trying to wrap around in my head when I was prepping for the interview is you're the narrator, and the narrator tells a story. I mean, that's one of the things the narrator does. So how do you work in the characters into the play? Like, how are those characters depicted?
Yeah, I mean, the narrator comes up and she starts telling this story. And as she does, I think just as we do when we are telling stories to each other, you want to imagine yourself in the moment. What was it like? And so you have the layer of the older narrator telling the story, but then in order to tell it the way she needs to see it through her own eyes as her 12-year-old self. And that's when the events come alive. And as she goes through telling the story, she inhabits these various characters that are so dear to herself. And so there isn't any change of costumes. There isn't any of that. There's just this slipping in and out of the different characters as she tells the story.
Oh, man. So it sounds so great. How many characters are there in total in Valhalla?
Well, Valhalla has a lot of characters, but the characters that I depict, I think there's about 10 different characters that really kind of come to life in the play.
The director for Ponderosa Pine is Arne McPherson. He is so great. I interviewed him a few months ago for Shakespeare in the Ruins. He was doing Iago Speaks. Tracy, can you talk about how the play was workshopped and the kinds of things that he worked with you on
During the
rehearsals?
Yeah. It was, I have to say, it's one of the best experiences I've had working on a show. It was very collaborative. We had all kinds of voices in the room to really help bring the story to life. In terms of working the play and figuring out how I was going to tell the story, there were many different layers. There's the layer of developing the different characters and making them unique. And then there's the layer of, where am I on stage and kind of those basics. But then to go deeper into the text, this beautiful, poetic, and heightened text that Andraea has written for us, how do I then make it as clear and concise as I possibly can to tell the story in a very specific and detailed way, especially because it is only me on stage. So to really find the nuances of the shifts within the text and which parts are highlighted and which parts are more of the foundation of the event. And then also this story of the narrator, of watching her young self tell the story of these events that have affected her, and also then to figure out how the narrator feels about telling the story and her relationship to her memories and to her past.
Oh, wow. And Andraea, as the playwright, can you talk about your role in the rehearsals? Like, did you have in mind like a specific vision, or was it a little bit more fluid and a little bit more free-formed in your mind? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I definitely, in writing the play, could picture it in my head in a sort of filmic point of view, like not necessarily how I would stage it on stage, but just I could see I could see what the pictures I was describing would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And when Arn was hired to work on the show, he and I had a discussion about like, what does the set look like? Because there's so many different places that this narrator goes, and there's so many different characters that she plays. And we both agreed that having a really simple, beautiful backdrop would be the best way that we could just transition from place to place to place to place.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was something that once I knew what that was in place, and then once we had Tracy as the actor, that I was just like, all right, it doesn't matter to me what happens now, because I trust Arn so much, and the vision, his interpretation, as we had kind of talked about it, was in line with how I could think the play would work. And I trust and admire Tracy just so much that to be in the room was a real gift. I wasn't rewriting constantly and being in the room and trying to sort it out. I felt really confident that what feedback came from the room, I would be able to make changes to fit what they needed. But at the same time that I didn't have to be there all the time, because I knew they were going to do great work. Yeah. And for me, like my background is always in like creating new work and also self-producing. So it was such a gift to be able to just be a playwright and trust the team and not have to think about every detail.
Right.
And just learning about that experience and that role was a really cool journey for me in this particular project.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about staging and whatever and that kind of thing. There is a sound design element and lighting in this show. Can you both talk about sort of how that helps to tell the story?
Yeah, I am thrilled with our lighting that Adam has brought in and the sound that Dasha has contributed. I feel like I'm not so alone on stage. You know, the text, as I said earlier, it's so poetic, and the images that it carries are almost otherworldly, that for me to try to show some of those, it's actually simpler for me to just say the words and let the lighting and the sound create the world for me.
Right.
And it really, they've brought so much magic and theatricality to the stage with their designs. It really has been such a collaborative effort on just such a lovely team.
How is a Ponderosa Pine recreated?
In your imagination, I think. Yeah, there's no tree on stage. And it's funny that you asked that, like, because I actually have never missed it. I've always just imagined it there as you described it.
Well, the tree takes a journey as well, right? Mm-hmm. The tree has its own journey through the play. So then how would you then change that with minimal design? And I think the words, the images that Andrea has written for us carries it further than anything we could possibly try to recreate on the stage.
Right. And my understanding is it's like the trunk of the tree sort of represents the souls of the people in the town. Am I off base on that, or is that one way of looking at it?
I think that's a great way to look at it. It's not the only way to look at it, and it wasn't my number one intention, but I love it. Like, absolutely.
Yeah, the idea of the roots, our roots, that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, I find the premise so interesting. It almost seems like Valhalla is a story of one family, which essentially it is. So conceivably, every family could have a small town on the prairie. Is that what you were thinking when you were writing the play? And am I off base with that? And was that something that you were trying to get across in the play as well?
It's interesting. I was asking myself similar questions on opening night because, you know, in watching the play now a number of times, we say that this is Valhalla, which is kind of equivalent to heaven. Mm-hmm. And yet this narrator talks about how everybody in the town is just like her. So my intention is not that, you know, heaven is just my family and no one else can come. And I don't think that's what the audience gets out of it. Yeah. But that when I picture, if there's anything that would be satisfying to me in an afterlife, if there was it would be this idea that I could be reconnecting with people that have passed, but also the people that came before, and having a sense of understanding about those who I am from a more profound point of view, not just the stories I inherit, but that sort of lineage. So that's how I illustrated it in this show. And absolutely, I think that for anybody else, their interpretation of that sort of afterlife or rebirth or re-meeting, whatever that is, like, I think everybody could have a different town or a different interpretation. It's kind of fascinating to talk about.
Different town on the prairie, absolutely. My grandmother used to keep telling me as a child, family is everything. Without it, you've got nothing. Is that something else that you hope people will take away from the play? And what do you both hope people will take away with them after seeing the show? Tracy, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's about family. I think it's also about community. I think that no matter where you come from, whether it's the big city or a small town, I think for myself, going through the play and working on it, I reflect on what those events in my past, the ones that stand out, and how I see them and how do I feel about them, and telling those stories. And I think no matter where you come from, thinking about where you came from and honoring the past, no matter if it's good, bad, or ugly, but to see it maybe from a different point of view or accept it for what it is. I think that's really important to move forward with who you want to be today and where do you see yourself in your own community now.
And Andrea, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I often think about the difference between like fraternity and community, and in my mind, that's very similar to also like city life versus rural life. Whereas fraternity, you get to like choose who you want to be around, people who are like you. And in the city, you can do that. You can be like, I work in theater. This is my theater community. Or I go to church. This is my church community. But in a small town, in the true sense of community, and I think also in family, you get what you get. And you work with that community and you work with that family, for, like you said, for good or for bad. And so I don't know. I don't think that family is everything, but I think learning to be in that family and be where you are and to forgive and accept and love and understand people for being imperfect. I think that's more the message of the show and why I chose a small town as the backdrop.
Yeah, absolutely. Tracy and Andrea, this has just been so great having you here in studio talking about Ponderosa Pine. The play sounds so beautiful and fantastic. I'm actually looking forward to seeing it next Saturday. Thanks so much for taking the time to stop by our Classic 107 studio and talk to me today. This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.